The morning dawned cold, with the first snow of the season swirling gently outside the tall, jagged windows of Frostfall Castle. Princess Alara had waited for this moment, a turning point that would change everything. In the palace courtyard, beneath the shadow of ancient spires, she knelt in the snow with a copper basin, melting fresh snow over a small fire. Her pups, no more than a few weeks old, nestled against her as Alara bathed them gently, away from the prying eyes of the court. Above, the council watched from their towering windows, murmuring in disbelief. The servants whispered behind her back, clutching their pearls as Alara broke the most sacred protocol. King Kaelin, standing in the archway, said nothing. His expression was unreadable as he observed his queen, his mate, defy everything he had ever known about the royal traditions. For the first time, the royal pups, Alden, the loudest, Elia, quiet but watchful, and little Lyra, delicate and fierce, stopped crying. They were soothed, not by the cold ceremonial rituals, but by their mother's touch. "Tell me, where do you stand?" Because this is a story about a kingdom built on rules that no longer serve, and a mother who dares to put her children's comfort above centuries of ancient tradition. Alara had never truly belonged in the cold, imposing walls of Frostfall Castle. She was a daughter of a distant northern territory, her marriage to Kaelin a political alliance, a union forged in the flames of royal necessity. In the beginning, Kaelin had been patient, understanding, but distant. Over time, however, she had found something more, a love that softened even the hardest parts of his heart. She had fallen for him, as unexpected as it was, yet the palace was another matter entirely. There were rules for everything: how to speak, how to dress, how to breathe. She'd learned to navigate them, bending when she could, breaking them when she had no choice. But everything changed when the pups were born. 3 little lives, each unique, each demanding their own kind of love, their own kind of care. From the moment they were placed in her arms, Alara had known that they were meant for something different, something more than what the court had planned for them. She could feel it in the bond that connected them, stronger than any royal legacy, deeper than any ceremony. It wasn't always this way. When Alara first arrived at Frostfall, she had been a daughter of the North, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. The kingdom had offered her a life of luxury, but also a life bound by ancient rules that shackled her at every turn. Kaelin had been kind, but cold, a king who wore his duty as a crown, far heavier than his love for her. The palace had been full of whispers and traditions she couldn't escape, yet she had learned to survive within them. She had learned to perform the part of queen until the moment her pups were born, and everything shifted. From that first cry, from the first stirrings of motherhood, Alara knew there was no place for such cold rituals in her heart. The pull to care for her children, to hold them close, to feel their warmth against hers, it was primal, instinctive, undeniable. And yet, the cold stone halls of Frostfall Castle were filled with expectations that seemed more ancient than the very walls themselves. As the pups slept, their tiny chests rising and falling with the steady rhythm of peaceful dreams, Alara stood by the nursery window, gazing out at the pale winter sky. The snow had already begun to blanket the kingdom, transforming it into something otherworldly. And yet, inside the palace, a different kind of chill lingered. In the quiet of the room, Ilara's heart still raced from the defiance she had shown earlier. What kind of queen would she be if she followed these cruel traditions? The pups had barely been in the world a week, and already the palace had claimed them, marking them as pawns in a game Alara had no desire to play. There had been no joy in their first hours, only formality, ceremony, and an oppressive sense of duty. The soft, familiar sound of footsteps behind her interrupted her thoughts. Kalen entered, his tall form casting a shadow across the room. His eyes, always so guarded, so steady, fell on her, but there was a trace of something new in them. A tenderness, perhaps? "You're still awake," he murmured, his voice deep with exhaustion. "Shouldn't you be resting?" Alara shook her head, still unable to tear her gaze away from the soft flakes of snow drifting outside. She was still processing the events of the morning. "I can't," she said quietly, her voice low and steady, but laced with an edge of frustration. "I watched them suffer today, Kalen. Those rituals, they don't serve our pups. They only serve tradition, and it's wrong." He sighed and crossed the room to stand beside her. For a moment, they simply stood there, their shared silence heavy between them. His hand came to rest on her shoulder, the touch both reassuring and strangely distant. "You knew this would happen," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is the way of the kingdom. We don't have a choice. These traditions have been in place for generations. It's how we show respect to our ancestors." Alara turned to face him, her eyes dark with the weight of her emotions. "Respect or control? Do our ancestors want us to make our children suffer for the sake of ceremony? Because that's what I see. Our pups cried today, Kalen. They were uncomfortable, scared even. And all I could do was watch as they were passed from one stranger to the next." Her voice cracked, but she held her ground. "Is that what our ancestors wanted? To perpetuate a system where love has no place?" Kalen's face softened, but his eyes remained conflicted. "I grew up with these traditions, Alara," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "My father taught me that duty always comes first. He believed that the kingdom's stability rested on us adhering to the old ways. He thought it was what made us strong." Alara's chest tightened. "Your father was a king, Kalen, but I'm your queen, and I'm telling you that these traditions are not the strength you think they are. They are chains, not pillars." She paused, her hands clenching at her sides. "I can't sit idly by while our children are treated like objects in a ceremony. I won't do it." Kalen looked away for a moment, his jaw clenched in thought. Alara could feel the weight of his internal battle. He had been raised to believe in the sanctity of these practices, just as she had been raised to believe in the sanctity of motherhood. But she had learned long ago that not all traditions were sacred, and some things couldn't be ignored, no matter the cost. "I know," he muttered, almost to himself. "But it's not that simple. There's more at stake than just our personal feelings, Alara. If we don't follow the rules, the council will see it as a sign of weakness. The entire kingdom will start questioning everything we do. We can't afford that." "Then let them question it," she replied, her voice steady but sharp. "Let them see that we don't need to follow traditions that no longer serve us. The pups are ours, Kalen, and we're their parents. We should have the right to raise them as we see fit." Kalen's face darkened with the weight of his father's legacy. He stood there, silent, lost in thought, until finally he let out a long sigh. "I'll think about it," he said softly, running a hand through his hair. "But you have to understand, this isn't just about us. It's about the kingdom. It's about the people who look to us for guidance." Elara nodded, but couldn't bring herself to offer him comfort. Not yet. She needed him to understand, to see that his father's legacy and the traditions he clung to so desperately had only bred fear, not strength. As the night stretched on, the tension between them remained palpable, and Elara knew it would take more than words to convince him. He wasn't just battling her desire for change, he was battling the very ideals that had been ingrained in him from birth. And that was a much harder fight than either of them could have anticipated. Elara had never quite understood the weight of being royalty until she had become queen. Born to a distant northern territory, she had known little of the rigid customs that governed the kingdom of Frostfall. Her people had always been smaller, more free-spirited, no grand ceremonies or endless rituals. The marriage to Kaelin had been a strategic one, an alliance meant to bind the kingdom and secure peace. The romance, if it could even be called that, had come slowly, cautiously. At first, she had barely known him, and even as she learned of his kindness, his strength, there was always the cold, looming shadow of tradition hanging over everything. Her marriage had begun with the weight of expectation. Every decision she made had been scrutinized by the royal council, especially the High Counselor, Makos, whose loyalty to the old ways ran deep. Makos had made it clear from the very beginning that Elara was not just a queen in name, but a vessel of the kingdom's legacy. There would be no room for personal choices, no room for sentiment. She was to bear Kaelin's children, raise them as heirs to the throne, and most importantly, uphold the ancient traditions that had served the kingdom for centuries. But motherhood had changed everything for her. The moment Alden, Ilya, and Lyra were born, Elara had felt the deep, ancient bond that tied them to her in a way no royal duty ever could. She had never expected to love them as she did. To hold them in her arms, to feel their tiny hearts beat in rhythm with hers, it had shattered the world she had once known. A world filled with expectations of propriety and duty. The first royal ritual bath, however, had nearly broken her. It had been a solemn morning when Elara had watched helplessly as her pups were bathed by the royal priests in the grand hall. There had been no joy, no warmth, only the sterile, ritualistic process of tradition. Her children, her tiny, helpless children, were dunked into the water, their cries ringing in her ears as the priests recited the sacred prayers. The water, infused with oils from distant lands, was far too warm, and Elara could feel her own heart break as she watched the discomfort of her pups. Alden's cries were loud, furious. Ilya's were quieter, confused. And Lyra had screamed. Elara's wolf had stirred beneath her skin, urging her to act, but the weight of the palace's customs held her still. Kaelin's hand on her shoulder was a reminder that this was how things were done. The tradition demanded it. But it wasn't right. Elara's instincts told her that a mother's touch, not the cold hands of strangers, was what her children needed. They had barely been born, and already they were being used as political pawns in a game of royal tradition. After the ceremony, High Counselor Makos had appeared at her side, his face lined with disapproval. His cold, calculating eyes had scanned her face as if measuring her every move. "Your Majesty," he had said, his voice dripping with the weight of old customs. "This is a kingdom built on order. Tradition ensures stability. We cannot have these disruptions." Elara had bristled at the implication. "My children's comfort does not cause disruption, Counselor. The traditions that demand their suffering do." Makos had not responded, but the tension between them was palpable. His presence alone was enough to remind Alara of the ever-present forces pulling her back into the cold, unyielding traditions she was so desperate to escape. Alara knew the path she was on would not be easy. But as long as she had Kaelin at her side, she would continue to fight for what was right, for their children, for their family, and for the future of the kingdom. The old ways had served their time, but it was time for change. Let them watch, she thought, her mind racing with possibilities. Let them see what true leadership looks like. It was time to stop playing by rules that no longer made sense. If you believe it's time for traditions to serve the people, not control them, hit subscribe. Don't let the old ways continue to harm those who deserve better. Only those who side with the status quo, like Counselor Makos, will resist this change. Comment below if you're on the right side of history. The cold winds of winter continued to batter the high walls of Frostfall Castle, but inside, the temperature was rising. Every step Alara took through the palace halls now seemed charged with tension. The air crackled with whispers, every servant she passed turning away just slightly, murmuring in low voices behind her back. She could feel it, the disapproval, the judgment, the growing chasm between her and the very people she was supposed to rule beside. At first, it had been just the servants, the lower ranks, the ones who had no choice but to follow orders. They had watched her break tradition with wide eyes, clucking their tongues, secretly thankful they didn't have to follow her lead. But now, it wasn't just the servants. The nobles, those who had once smiled at her and bowed their heads with respect, were starting to voice their opinions. What kind of queen defies centuries of tradition for the sake of her children? Lady Doreen, a tall and icy woman with sharp eyes, had whispered to Lord Estan, her voice loud enough for Alara to hear from down the hall. The kingdom cannot afford such rebellion. What will it mean for the future if the queen turns her back on our ways? Alara had clenched her jaw, not allowing her anger to show. But it was there, simmering beneath the surface. She wasn't just the queen. She was the mother of the royal heirs, and she would not let anyone make her feel less than that. As she passed the grand dining hall, the voices grew louder, and she caught snippets of the ongoing gossip. It's a disgrace, what she's doing. Has she forgotten her place? She's turning the royal heirs into common children. Alara's hand tightened around the gold-handled bracelet that she wore, a gift from Kaelin on their wedding day, a reminder of their bond. But even that felt distant now. She had begun to understand just how deeply rooted these traditions were in the kingdom. It wasn't just a matter of old customs, it was an entire system built on control, on maintaining an image of perfection that, deep down, Alara now saw as a lie. And for the first time, she wondered if Kaelin had ever truly understood how oppressive it all was. The following morning, the royal council convened in the grand hall, a room that had seen centuries of decisions, both noble and cruel. Alara could feel the weight of it as she walked in, the stone walls heavy with history. The nobles were already gathered, their cold eyes fixed on her as she entered. Kaelin was sitting at the head of the table, his face a mask of authority. He looked at her, but it was the kind of look that seemed almost distant. She couldn't place it. Maybe it was the pressure of the council's eyes, or maybe it was his own doubts finally catching up to him. As soon as Alara took her seat, High Counselor Makos, a man whose loyalty to the old ways was unshakable, spoke. His voice, deep and calculated, echoed through the room. Your Majesty, he began, his eyes narrowing, we cannot allow this rebellion to continue. Your actions, taking matters into your own hands, defying the sacred traditions that have kept this kingdom stable for centuries, are not just a personal affront. They are a threat to the very foundation of Frostfall. Alara held his gaze, not breaking it, even as she felt the heat of the room closing in around her. These traditions, she said, her voice steady, have no place in a world where the well-being of our children is sacrificed for the sake of formality. I will not, cannot, stand by and watch as they suffer simply because it is expected of us. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the other council members. You all know it's wrong. You can see the discomfort in the faces of our pups, hear their cries. They need love, not ritual. There was a pause as murmurs rippled through the council. Some of them, like Lord Estan, exchanged glances filled with thinly veiled contempt. Others, like Lady Baron, looked uncertain, glancing at each other before shifting their eyes back to Elara. Makos wasn't done. He leaned forward, his tone sharp and accusing. And yet, Your Majesty, this is what has kept the kingdom strong. These rituals remind us of our duty to the crown, to our ancestors. If we deviate from them, even in the smallest way, we risk destabilizing everything. Elara's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel Kaylin's eyes on her now, watching, weighing her every word. But this was her fight. She would not back down. I am not questioning our duty to the kingdom, Counselor, she said, her voice rising, carrying the weight of her conviction. I am questioning a system that values protocol over the lives of our children. I refuse to sacrifice my pups on the altar of tradition. The room went silent. Even Makos seemed to hesitate, his sharp tongue momentarily lost for words. But then Kaylin spoke. His voice was calm but firm, a king's voice, an alpha's voice. Perhaps it's time we re-examine these traditions to see if they still serve their intended purpose. Elara's concerns are valid. The shock was immediate. Elara's eyes widened and Makos's face reddened as if he'd been slapped. The room filled with whispers, gasps, and low murmurs as the council members turned to each other. But it was clear. Kaylin had just set the stage for something that would change everything. Elara looked at him, trying to understand the weight of what he had just said. He wasn't fully with her, but for the first time, she could see that his mind was open. Open to the idea that the kingdom's rules might not be as sacred as they had once seemed. Makos shot to his feet, his anger now visible in the tense set of his jaw. Your Majesty, are you suggesting we abandon centuries of tradition because of... He paused, casting a venomous glance at Elara. Personal sentiment? Are we to let this queen's rebellion reshape the future of Frostfall? Kaylin's eyes darkened as he rose to his feet. Enough, Makos. Elara is my queen, and I support her. If the traditions no longer serve the kingdom or its people, we will look to change them. If you have an issue with that, you are welcome to bring it before me. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the tension thick enough to choke the air. Elara's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at Kaylin, unsure of what to feel. She had hoped for this moment, but the consequences were far greater than she had ever imagined. Later that day, after the council meeting had disbanded, Elara found herself alone in the royal gardens. The sun had barely set, and the crisp winter air nipped at her skin as she wandered, lost in thought. She hadn't expected the confrontation with the council to go this far, but now, as the weight of Kaylin's words settled on her shoulders, she wasn't sure where they stood. As she walked along the stone paths, she could hear Kaylin's footsteps behind her. His presence was like a shadow, both comforting and oppressive. She stopped, her breath visible in the cold air, and turned to face him. You didn't have to say that, she said softly, her voice full of uncertainty. You didn't have to defend me. The council will be furious. Kaylin stepped closer. his face a mixture of resolve and exhaustion. "I had to," he replied quietly. "What kind of king would I be if I didn't listen to the concerns of my queen?" "You're right, Ilara. We have to think about what's best for our family and for the future of this kingdom." Her heart swelled at his words, but something in the back of her mind warned her. She saw the hesitation in his eyes, the way his words faltered when he spoke of tradition. He wasn't ready to fully accept the change she needed, and that was the hardest part. "But?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He exhaled sharply, his gaze distant. "But I have been raised to uphold these traditions, to respect the legacy of my father. It's not something that can be dismissed so easily, Ilara." She reached out, her hand gently resting on his. "I know, but I can't do this alone." "You have to decide where you stand, Kaylin." His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to close. "I don't know," he said softly, almost to himself. "I want to be with you, Ilara, but I can't shake the feeling that we're walking into uncharted waters. The future of the kingdom isn't something I can just rewrite overnight." The divide had only just begun to widen, but Ilara was ready. She would fight for her children, for the future of Frostfall, and for the love that Kaylin and she had built together, whatever the cost. But Kaylin's hesitation lingered, and as the shadows grew longer in the gardens, Ilara couldn't help but wonder if he would ever fully walk beside her in this fight, or if tradition would continue to stand between them. The days that followed the royal council meeting were filled with tension, both within the palace walls and between Ilara and Kaylin. Every glance exchanged between them seemed to carry an unspoken weight, an unresolved question lingering between them. They were two forces, one driven by love, the other by duty, struggling to find common ground in a kingdom ruled by ancient traditions. Ilara felt the pull of her maternal instincts more strongly each day. The pups, Alden, Ilya, and little Lyra, were thriving under her care. But it wasn't just about feeding them or seeing them grow. It was about protecting them from the suffocating protocols of the palace that threatened to erase their innocence. The more time she spent with them, the more she understood the depth of her responsibility. Not only as queen, but as a mother who would not let her children suffer for the sake of tradition. It was late one evening, long after the royal court had settled into its usual rhythm of gossip and whispers, that Ilara found herself alone in the garden. The stillness of the night air, a welcome reprieve from the palace's constant hum of tension. She gazed at the stars above, the moonlight casting shadows over the stone paths, and for a moment, she let herself breathe. Then, she heard the familiar footfalls of Kaylin approaching. His presence was like a shadow, a reminder of the complexities that bound them together. He stood behind her for a moment, silent, before speaking. "Ilara," he said, his voice softer than usual. "We need to talk." She didn't turn to face him immediately. Instead, she stared out into the distance, the weight of her next words already heavy on her tongue. "I can't keep quiet about this anymore, Kaylin," she said, her voice firm, but tinged with the exhaustion of constant conflict. "I can't let our pups suffer under these traditions. They don't need ritual. They need their mother. They need comfort. They need love." He stepped closer, his presence enveloping her like a storm. "I know," he said quietly, his voice a mixture of regret and hesitation. "I saw what happened with the ritual baths. I felt it too, the discomfort, the way they cried when they were handled by those strangers. It wasn't right." Ilara turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Then why are we still doing this? Why are we letting the council dictate what's best for our children? Why are we pretending that tradition is more important than their happiness? Kalen ran a hand through his hair, frustration clouding his expression. It's not that simple, Ilara. You know that. I was raised to believe that these rituals were sacred, that they were what made us strong. My father believed in them. My grandfather did too. These traditions, they've held this kingdom together for generations. If we abandon them now, what happens next? What kind of message does it send? Is that really what you believe? Ilara's voice shook with the intensity of her emotions. Or are you just afraid to challenge what your father and grandfather set in motion? You've always been so tied to the past, Kalen. You've always believed that the old ways were the only ways, but I see it now. I see how these traditions are suffocating us, suffocating our children, and I won't stand by and let that happen. Not anymore. Kalen's jaw tightened, and for a long moment, he said nothing. The weight of his indecision hung heavily in the air. Ilara could see the conflict warring within him, the love he had for her, the loyalty he felt to his kingdom, and the pressure of his father's legacy that seemed to weigh him down like an anchor. I'm torn, he said at last, his voice heavy with uncertainty. I love you, Ilara, and I love our children, but I was raised to uphold these traditions. I don't know how to just throw them aside. Ilara stepped closer to him, her hand reaching for his. Then let's find a way together. We don't have to abandon everything, but we have to make a choice. A choice for our family. Our children come first, Kalen, not the council, not the kingdom's image. Them. He looked down at her hand, the uncertainty still in his eyes. What are you asking for, Ilara? He whispered. What kind of compromise are you hoping for? Ilara's heart pounded in her chest as she spoke the words she knew would be the first step toward the change she longed for. I want to care for the pups in private, Kalen. I want to bathe them, hold them, love them without the watchful eyes of the council. Let the rituals continue if you must, but give me this, give them this. I will not let anyone else touch them unless it's necessary. Kalen's expression softened as he met her eyes, and for the first time, Ilara saw the glimmer of agreement in his gaze. He nodded slowly, as though coming to terms with the idea. All right, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. We'll do it your way, for now. We'll keep the rituals, but you'll have your time with them. We'll make this work. Ilara's heart surged with relief, but beneath that, she felt a deep sadness. This wasn't the victory she had hoped for, but it was a step. It was a sign that Kalen was beginning to listen, beginning to question the very traditions that had once been his unshakable foundation. The days following their private conversation brought a temporary calm, but beneath the surface, the tension at court only continued to grow. While Ilara had gained a small victory, it felt hollow. The council was still watching, still judging, and the more she spoke out, the more it became clear that her actions were starting to cause a fracture between her and the rest of the royal court. Lord Estan, ever the traditionalist, made no secret of his disdain for Ilara's decisions. He was one of the loudest voices in the court, and every time she entered a room, his sharp, disapproving gaze followed her. There were hushed conversations behind her back, and every glance felt like a judgment. But it wasn't just the nobles who disapproved. Some of the servants, those who had once admired her for her strength and grace, began to whisper among themselves, questioning her ability to lead the kingdom. They feared that her defiance would tear the kingdom apart, that the image of a perfect royal family their symbol of strength, was slowly unraveling. Ilara's actions could set a dangerous precedent, one of the palace servants had muttered to another, speaking in low tones. What happens when every royal starts questioning the old ways? What will become of the kingdom then? Ilara heard these whispers. She couldn't escape them. And while she was undeterred in her belief that she was doing what was right, the weight of the court's division pressed down on her shoulders. In the quiet of the royal nursery one night, as she bathed her pups in the gentle glow of candlelight, Ilara found herself reflecting on the decisions she had made. The pups, now a few weeks old, were beginning to thrive under her care. Alden was growing louder, always the first to demand attention, while Elia watched everything with a cautious curiosity. And little Lyra, always the smallest, seemed to hold a quiet strength within her, an inner fire that Ilara could feel every time their eyes met. As she bathed them in the pure snowmelt she had taken to using, Ilara couldn't help but think of how far she had come since that first ritual bath. The pups had not cried this time. Instead, they seemed comforted, soothed by the presence of their mother, their eyes soft with trust. And as she cradled them, her bond with them deepened, more than she ever thought possible. The more she challenged the palace's traditions, the stronger her connection to her children became. She could feel their needs, their desires, their fears, and she would do anything to protect them. But as she gazed down at her children, she realized something else. She was changing too. The more she defied the court's expectations, the more her voice grew louder, stronger. The more she fought for her children's happiness, the more she realized that she couldn't go back to the way things were. There was no turning back now. The court may have been divided, but Ilara was resolute. She would fight for her family, for her children, and for the kingdom's future, no matter what it cost. The night was still. The only sound in the vast corridors of Frostfall Castle was the soft, rhythmic whisper of the wind against the walls. Ilara had just settled into bed beside Kaelin, the weight of the day's decisions pressing on her chest. The quiet comfort of her chambers was a temporary reprieve from the constant tension that had become her life in the palace. But then, the sound reached her. A muffled cry, soft but distinct, echoed through the walls of the castle. Her heart jolted in her chest, and without hesitation, she pushed herself up from the bed. She glanced at Kaelin, who lay still beside her, his chest rising and falling in the slow, peaceful rhythm of sleep. Ilara didn't have the luxury of rest, not tonight. She stood and pulled the woolen robe tighter around her shoulders, the chill of the castle biting at her skin. The sound of the cries grew louder as she made her way through the dark corridors. The pups, Alden, Elia, and little Lyra, had always been restless at night, but tonight felt different. Their cries were desperate, the kind that gnawed at a mother's soul. Without a second thought, Ilara moved through the winding halls toward the nursery. The strict rules of the palace flooded her mind, reminding her that she wasn't allowed to be with the pups at night unless under the supervision of a nurse. The idea of a stranger tending to her children, her precious pups, seemed foreign, like an invasion. The walls of tradition that had kept her at a distance from them felt suffocating. And yet, it was in the quietest hours, when all the rules seemed to disappear, that Ilara knew what she had to do. She pushed open the door to the nursery, her heart in her throat. The sight of the pups, small and vulnerable, lying in their cribs, their little bodies trembling with every cry, made her blood run cold. Alden's cries were sharp and demanding. Elia's were soft and uncertain, and Lyra's were the most heart-wrenching, small, pitiful whimpers that seemed to pierce the air with their anguish. They were alone. The nurse, as usual, was nowhere to be found. Elara knew they had probably stepped away for a moment. Such moments always seemed to come at the wrong time. But Elara wasn't going to wait for the nurse. She wasn't going to follow the palace's rigid rules anymore. Not when her children were in distress. With a soft, steady breath, Elara bent over the cribs, her hands shaking as she gently lifted Alden first, his small body already starting to calm at the touch of his mother's arms. His cries quieted as she held him close, her warmth wrapping around him like a cocoon. Next, she scooped up Elia, who instinctively pressed into her chest with a whimper of relief. Finally, she turned to Lyra, her smallest pup, whose cries had become almost silent by the time Elara gently cradled her in her arms. The pups' bodies seemed to settle in the comfort of her embrace. The warmth of their tiny forms pressed against her chest, their breaths slow and steadying as they found peace in her care. Elara couldn't help but let the tears slip from her eyes, feeling the deep connection between them, a bond that had nothing to do with titles or traditions and everything to do with love. She didn't notice him at first, but then the soft sound of a floorboard creaking beneath a heavy footstep pulled her from her thoughts. Elara looked up, her eyes meeting the familiar gaze of Kaelin standing in the doorway. He hadn't said a word, hadn't made a sound as he entered, and yet there he was, watching her in the quiet shadows. His gaze was intense, but there was no judgment in it, only something softer, something deeper. He stood still, his broad shoulders outlined against the dim light from the hallway, his eyes fixed on the peaceful scene unfolding before him. "Kaelin," Elara said softly, her voice thick with emotion. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but his quiet presence was a comfort. She glanced down at the pups in her arms, the soft rise and fall of their breaths soothing her, grounding her. "I couldn't leave them to cry. They needed me." Kaelin didn't speak at first, his silence settling between them like an unsaid question. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, quietly, until he was standing beside her. His eyes softened as he looked at the pups in her arms. The steady beat of their tiny hearts was almost audible in the room, their little bodies still and content for the first time that night. "I see that," he said softly, his voice a quiet whisper, as if afraid to disturb the peace they had found together. "You've always known what they need." For the first time in days, Elara allowed herself to relax, just for a moment. She felt Kaelin's presence beside her, his warmth a silent support as he gazed down at their children with a tenderness that had always been buried beneath the weight of duty and tradition. Kaelin reached out slowly, his hand brushing against Alden's tiny head, his fingers gentle as they rested there. "I didn't know it would be like this," he murmured, his voice full of a quiet awe. "I didn't know how strong this bond was, how deep it runs. I didn't realize how much you were willing to fight for them." Elara's heart swelled with emotion, but her voice remained steady. "I've always known what they need, Kaelin. And it's not ritual, it's not ceremony, it's love." She paused, feeling the truth of her words settle into the air. "And I will do whatever it takes to protect that love, to protect them." Kaelin's gaze softened, his hand lingering on the pups before pulling away, as if afraid to disrupt the fragile peace they had found. He stepped back slightly, still watching them, and Alara could see the wheels turning in his mind. His deep blue eyes were filled with uncertainty, but there was something else there too, something she hadn't seen before. A flicker of understanding, of realization. "I see it now," he whispered, his voice a little hoarse. "I see why you can't let them follow these old traditions. It's not just about defying the council, is it? It's about protecting them, protecting their future." Alara nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She knew what he meant. This wasn't just about her. It was about their children, their future. She couldn't let them be bound by the same suffocating traditions that had plagued their ancestors. "I won't let them suffer under those rules," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "I won't let them be used as pawns in a game that doesn't care about their well-being. They deserve more than that. We all do." Kalen's lips pressed into a thin line as he looked down at the pups again. His eyes flicked between them and Alara, his heart clearly torn. "But if we go too far, if we break too many of the rules, what will become of us? What will become of Frostfall?" Alara stood tall, her chest rising with the certainty that had been building inside her. "If we let Frostfall fall apart because of these old customs, then maybe we need to rebuild it. Maybe we need a new way, a way that values love over tradition, family over protocol." Kalen was silent for a long moment, watching her, the struggle in his eyes slowly giving way to something else, something like acceptance. "I never understood that," he admitted softly. "I thought tradition was everything, but seeing you with them, with our pups, I can see that maybe I was wrong." He paused, his voice steady but full of quiet emotion. "Maybe love is the tradition that matters most." Alara's heart leapt in her chest. She had always known that Kalen was a man of duty, but there, in that moment, she saw the flicker of something more. Something she had longed for him to see. "I can't promise I'll change everything at once," he said quietly. "But I'll stand with you, Alara, for our children, for our family." Her heart swelled with relief and love, and for the first time since she'd come to Frostfall, she felt as though they were truly standing together. Not as queen and king bound by duty, but as parents, partners. The silence in the nursery was thick and peaceful. The only sound the soft breaths of their children, now content and still. Alara held them close, Kalen beside her, and for a moment, the future didn't seem so uncertain. It felt like they had taken the first step towards something new, something better. But even in that peace, Alara knew the path ahead would be hard. The council would not let them go easily. Makos and the others would fight this change with everything they had. But she didn't care. She had Kalen's quiet support now, and with it, she felt ready to face whatever the kingdom would throw their way. The real battle had only just begun. The grand hall was thick with tension. Alara could feel it pressing against her chest as she walked through the towering doors, the weight of the royal council's gaze heavy on her shoulders. The grand chamber, with its marble floors and towering stone columns, was as imposing as it was cold, a perfect reflection of the customs that had shaped the kingdom for centuries. It was a place where tradition reigned, where decisions were made behind closed doors, where whispers of power and control swirled like a storm. Today, that storm was aimed directly at her. The members of the royal council sat at their usual places at the long table, their expressions severe and unyielding. High Counselor Makos was already standing, his back straight and his hands clasped behind him, ready to begin the verbal assault. He was the first to speak, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Queen Elara," he began, his tone dripping with disdain. "We have called you here today to address your flagrant disregard for the customs that have kept this kingdom stable for centuries. Your actions in the nursery, disregarding the presence of the royal nurses, defying centuries of royal tradition by taking matters into your own hands, have gone too far." The words stung, but Elara held her ground, standing tall before the council. She wasn't about to show any sign of weakness. She had fought for this moment, for the right to stand up for her children, and she would not be cowed now. "I did what I felt was right for my children," Elara replied firmly, her voice steady but full of conviction. "Their cries were unbearable, and no rule, no tradition should come before the comfort of my pups. They are not pawns to be used in a game of power. They are children, and they deserve a mother's love, not a royal performance." Makos's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a tight, disapproving line. "This is not about love, Your Majesty. This is about duty. This is about what is expected of the royal family. You may have been born in a distant land, but you are now the Queen of Frostfall. Your actions have shown a complete disregard for the values that have upheld this kingdom for generations." Elara's jaw clenched. She could feel the weight of the entire council's judgment bearing down on her. They were angry, they were frightened, and they were desperate to maintain the status quo, to keep the traditions that had served them all these years. But none of that mattered to Elara, not anymore. "My duty is to my children," she said, her voice unwavering. "And if that means challenging the old ways, then so be it. I will not allow them to suffer under these rituals for the sake of tradition. I am their mother, and it is my responsibility to protect them." There was a tense silence as the council members exchanged looks, some of them visibly uncomfortable with her boldness, while others, like Lord Astan, stiffened in anger. The divide between them was growing wider by the second. Makos turned to Kaelin, who had been sitting quietly beside Elara, his face inscrutable. "And you, Your Majesty? You stand by your wife's actions?" The council's eyes turned to Kaelin, the king who had remained silent throughout Elara's defense. For a long moment, Kaelin didn't respond. He sat there, his fingers drumming lightly on the arm of his chair, his eyes downcast. Elara could feel the weight of his indecision pressing down on her, and for a brief second, doubt flickered in her heart. Would he side with her? Or would he remain loyal to the traditions that had bound him since birth? Finally, Kaelin stood. The room fell into an eerie silence as he straightened his back, his regal posture commanding attention. Elara's heart skipped a beat as she watched him step forward, his face hardening as he looked at the council. "I have heard your concerns," Kaelin began, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of responsibility. "I understand the importance of tradition in maintaining the strength of this kingdom. I was raised to believe that the old ways were sacred, that duty came before all else. But I also see the truth in my wife's words. I have seen how the pups respond to her care, how they calm in her arms, how they thrive in her love. And I cannot ignore that." Elara's breath caught in her chest as she looked at him, the words she had longed to hear finally escaping his lips. But even as he spoke, she could feel the tension in the room shift, like a storm was about to break. The rituals that have been followed for centuries may have served their purpose once. Kaelin continued, his voice growing firmer. But our children, Ilara's and mine, deserve more than what the court expects of them. They deserve to be treated as children first, not symbols of a kingdom's power. If we are to move forward, to create a future for this kingdom that is not bound by fear and ritual, then we must reevaluate what it means to be royal. We must change. There was an audible gasp from the council. Makos's face turned a shade darker, his hands trembling with barely contained fury. You would throw away the very foundation of this kingdom for the sake of a few moments of sentiment, he spat. What would your father say, Kaelin? What would his father say? Have you forgotten who you are? Kaelin's gaze hardened, and for the first time, Ilara saw the steely determination behind his eyes. I am the king of Frostfall, he said, his voice ringing with authority. And I will not let the weight of history bind me to actions that harm my family. I will not let my children suffer in silence because of outdated traditions. As king, it is my duty to protect them. And that is exactly what I intend to do. The silence that followed was deafening. The council members sat frozen, some in shock, others in disbelief. High Counselor Makos, the man who had been the most vocal in opposing Ilara's actions, stood motionless, his lips trembling with rage. Ilara could feel the room's eyes on her, and for the first time since this battle had begun, she didn't feel alone. Kaelin had taken a stand. Kaelin had chosen their family. He had chosen her. She turned to him, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and pride. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She had never doubted him, but now, standing beside him in this moment, she saw a side of him she had never truly understood before. He was not just a king bound by duty. He was a father, a partner, and a man willing to change for the people he loved. Kaelin met her gaze, his expression softening. I'm sorry it took me so long, he said quietly. But I see now. I see how much this matters, and I won't let anyone, tradition, or the council, stand in our way. The council meeting erupted into chaos. Some members shouted in disbelief, demanding that Kaelin retract his statement. Others, like Lord Theron, whispered in hushed tones, clearly in favor of what Kaelin had said. The room was a whirlwind of opposing views, each voice more urgent than the last. But Makos remained silent, his gaze fixed on Kaelin with a look of betrayal, as though he had just witnessed the breaking of something sacred. His voice, when it finally came, was cold and cutting. You have just condemned this kingdom to chaos, Makos said, his eyes boring into Kaelin's. Your father would have never allowed such rebellion. The stability of Frostfall is built on the strength of our traditions. Without them, we are nothing. Kaelin's gaze didn't falter. Then perhaps it is time to redefine what makes us strong, Counselor, he said, his voice steady. Maybe it's not the old ways that have made us strong. Maybe it's our willingness to adapt, to change, to protect those we love. Makos opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, he turned and stormed out of the room, his robes trailing behind him like the final remnants of a dying regime. As the meeting came to a close, the room was still divided. Some members were visibly shaken by Kaelin's decision, while others quietly nodded in approval. Ilara knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but this was the first step, the beginning of change. Kaelin turned to her, his face softened by the weight of the decision he had just made.
"It's just the beginning,"
he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper.
"But it's a start."
Ilara's heart swelled with love and pride as she reached for his hand. "Thank you, Kaylin, for everything." For the first time in a long while, Ilara felt the stirrings of hope. A hope that they could truly change the future of Frostfall. Together. Frostfall Castle stood strong, as it always had, but the kingdom itself, its people, its ways, was shifting. Change had begun like a small ripple in a vast ocean. Hardly noticeable at first, but with each passing day, it grew stronger, more pronounced. What Ilara had started, what she had fought so hard for, was no longer just an issue for the royal family. It was becoming a movement, a quiet revolution stirring in the hearts of those who had once quietly accepted tradition's iron grip. The first signs of change were subtle. At court, there were still whispers, some disapproving, some hopeful. But in the marketplaces, in the streets, in the homes of the common people, a different energy was starting to rise. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent. It was the soft murmur of mothers, of fathers, of families, quietly questioning the ways they had been taught to follow. Ilara had always known there was more to being a queen than simply wearing a crown or attending ceremonial dinners. Now, she was starting to see the tangible effects of her defiance. One morning, as she walked through the royal gardens, Ilara could hear a soft voice calling her name. She turned to find a familiar face, Lady Baron, a once aloof noblewoman who had quietly supported the old ways, but now seemed to have a different light in her eyes. "Your Majesty," Lady Baron said, her voice hesitant but laced with something new, something like admiration. I wanted to thank you for what you've done, for showing us there's another way." Ilara was taken aback. "What do you mean?" Lady Baron glanced around as though to make sure no one else was listening. "The changes in the court, the way you've stood up for your children, for their well-being, it's made me rethink everything I thought I knew. I've been questioning the old rituals, the way we've always done things, and I know others are too. It's spreading." Ilara smiled, the weight of Lady Baron's words settling deep within her. "I didn't do this alone," Ilara said quietly. "It's the love of a mother that drives these changes. If that can inspire others, then perhaps we're starting something that matters." Lady Baron nodded, her expression softening. "Perhaps we are." Meanwhile, in the royal halls, Kaylin was beginning to see the shift in the kingdom with his own eyes. He had never been blind to the kingdom's customs, but seeing them through Ilara's eyes, through the eyes of a mother, had opened his heart in ways he never thought possible. The more time passed, the more he found himself questioning not just the rituals surrounding his children, but the larger framework of royal duty itself. For weeks now, Kaylin had watched the subtle changes in his people, the small acts of defiance that were quietly challenging the long-standing customs of the court. And although he had once feared that this quiet rebellion might fracture the kingdom, he now found himself wondering if it was exactly what the kingdom needed. One evening, as the castle's golden lights flickered in the distance, Kaylin stood on the balcony, gazing out over the kingdom. The wind blew softly through his hair, and he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. Below, the streets were bustling with activity, vendors shouting out their wares, families walking together, children laughing. And in their eyes, Kaylin saw something he hadn't seen before. It was a quiet, growing strength. Ilara had changed him. In so many ways, she had made him see his kingdom with fresh eyes. Eyes that no longer focused solely on tradition and the weight of legacy, but on the people who lived and breathed within it. He had always believed that duty was the cornerstone of leadership, that his actions should be guided by tradition, by the ancient rules that had governed Frostfall for generations. But now, as he stood there, looking out over his kingdom, Kalen realized that the weight of tradition was not the only thing that mattered. It was the well-being of his people, their happiness, their love. That was the true foundation of a kingdom's strength. And it was time he, too, embraced that truth. Days passed, and with each one, more and more families began to quietly embrace the changes that Alara had set in motion. Mothers, once fearful of defying the norms of court, began to step forward, choosing to raise their children in ways that felt right for them, not bound by rituals that had long since lost their meaning. In the halls of Frostfall Castle, the divide between the old ways and the new began to take shape. Those who had clung to the ancient rituals found themselves standing on shaky ground, while those who supported Ilara's changes began to find their voices. It was a subtle shift, but it was undeniable. The kingdom was slowly transforming before their eyes, and Ilara's influence, quiet and powerful, became a beacon for the women of the kingdom. She had become a role model, not just for the mothers of the royal court, but for mothers everywhere. Her defiance, her unwillingness to bow to tradition, had ignited something deep within them. A fire that had long been smoldering, waiting for someone to stand up and say, "Enough." Alara could feel it. The change was happening, and it was happening because of the choices she had made, the choices she had fought for. She had no illusions that the road ahead would be easy. The court was still divided, and many nobles, especially Maikos, remained steadfast in their resistance to change. But Alara knew that this was only the beginning. And with each new voice that joined her, with each new family that embraced the shift in perspective, she knew the change was becoming inevitable. It was on one particularly quiet evening that Kalen approached Alara in the royal gardens. He had been reflecting on the events of the past several months, on his own journey, on Alara's influence, and on the future of their kingdom. "Alara," he said, his voice quieter than usual. I've been thinking about my father, about everything he taught me, and everything you've shown me." Alara looked at him, her heart filling with a sense of cautious hope. "What have you been thinking?" Kalen stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "I've always believed that duty came first, that tradition was what made us strong. But now, I see that there's more to leadership than that. It's about love. It's about compassion. It's about understanding that we are here to serve the people, not the other way around." Ilara's chest tightened as she realized the depth of his words. "And what does that mean for us? For Frostfall?" Kalen reached out, taking her hand in his. "It means that we need to create a new legacy, one that values love, family, and the well-being of our people above all else. A kingdom that moves forward, not shackled by the past, but driven by the needs of the present and the future." A smile tugged at Ilara's lips, the weight in her heart easing just a little. "You're beginning to understand." "I am," Kalen said, a hint of relief in his voice. "And I have you to thank for that." That night, as Alara lay beside Kalen, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had always believed that love was the foundation of everything, that it was the one thing that could never be undermined by tradition, by ritual, or by the passage of time. As she drifted off to sleep, she knew that the kingdom was changing. The quiet revolution was far from over, but it had begun. And in the hearts of the people, in the hearts of the families who were starting to question the old ways, Ilara's influence had become a spark, a spark that would ignite the future of Frostfall. The air around Frostfall Castle was crisp, carrying the scent of early winter, but it was not just the season that felt fresh and new. Change was in the air, palpable and undeniable, sweeping through the kingdom like a gust of wind that couldn't be ignored. It was a new era, one that had begun in the nursery, in the quiet moments when Alara had cradled her children, not in ceremonial robes, but in the warmth of her love. Alara and Kaelin stood side by side in the grand hall, looking out over the kingdom they had vowed to protect. In the past, their relationship with tradition had been one of duty, but now, together, they were creating a new kind of leadership, a leadership based on love, choice, and family. Their first step? A new tradition that would resonate through the entire kingdom, one that would prioritize the bond between parent and child over the weight of protocol. "We've waited long enough," Alara said, her voice firm yet warm as she turned to Kaelin. "It's time we make this official. A tradition that isn't just about ceremony and politics, but about what really matters, our children." Kaelin nodded, his usual reserved expression softened by a quiet understanding. "You've made me see what I had failed to see before," he said, his hand resting lightly on hers. "Love is what makes a kingdom strong, not blind adherence to rituals. We will create something new." The day of the new bathing ritual arrived, and for the first time since her arrival in Frostfall, Alara felt a calm certainty settle in her chest. This was it, the moment when the royal family would take the first steps toward changing the very heart of Frostfall's traditions. The palace was filled with murmurs, some excited, others uncertain. The council had been notified, of course, and although many had voiced their displeasure, others were intrigued by the idea of a new tradition that broke away from the old ways. Word had spread throughout the kingdom too. The streets buzzed with talk of the new ritual, and Alara knew that her actions today would send ripples far beyond the walls of the castle. She stood in the courtyard, the light dusting of snow glistening in the morning sun. In front of her was a simple copper basin, filled with fresh snow that had been carefully gathered by the palace servants. There were no ornate braziers, no sacred oils, nothing to signify old rituals. It was just a basin, a fire to melt the snow, and the love of a mother. The pups, Alden, Elia, and Lyra, were already being brought forward by the servants, but this time, it wasn't under the watchful eyes of royal priests or highborn attendants. It was under Ilara's watchful eyes. Kaelin stood beside her, his presence both a silent support and a statement to the kingdom. This was no longer just Ilara's fight. It was his too. The love for their children, their family, was now their shared cause. Ilara knelt beside the basin, her hands steady as she began to scoop the snow into the copper vessel. She glanced at Kaelin, who was watching her with a gaze that had softened over the past months. No longer the king burdened by protocol, but a father, a husband, a partner. "Are you ready?" she asked him softly, her heart full of both excitement and nervousness. He smiled, though it was tinged with the weight of the moment. "I am. Let's do this." The first pup, Alden, was placed in Ilara's arms. He was growing quickly, his small body no longer as fragile as it had been in those first days, but he still relied on his mother's touch to soothe him. As she held him in her arms, she could feel the tension in her chest begin to ease. The eyes of the kingdom were on her now, but she didn't care. In her arms was her son, her flesh and blood, and no tradition could change that. The fire beneath the basin crackled, the flames warming the snow and turning it into steam that curled into the cold morning air. Ilara gently dipped her hands into the warm water, testing it before she began to pour it over Alden's soft fur. The warmth of the water contrasted with the cold of the courtyard, a symbolic representation of the new tradition they were starting. A tradition not based on ceremonial coldness, but on warmth, love, and comfort. As she bathed Alden, she couldn't help but look around at the gathering crowd. Many were watching from the windows of the palace. Others stood behind the lines of servants and attendants, their faces painted with curiosity or skepticism. Some of them, the older nobles, the ones who clung to the old ways, looked displeased, but others, the younger mothers, the common folk, looked on with interest. Elara could see the hope in their eyes, the possibility of a new future where they, too, might be able to choose what was best for their children. She finished bathing Alden, wrapping him carefully in a soft linen cloth. He let out a contented sigh, his small body calm in her arms, the tension from earlier completely gone. Next came Ilya, the quieter of the two boys, always the observer. As Elara bathed him, she could feel his trust in her. He didn't need the ritualistic rites, he needed her, his mother, and that was enough. The new tradition was taking root, and it was as much for the children as it was for the parents. Finally, she turned to little Lyra, her smallest pup, the one who had been most affected by the royal ceremonies. Lyra's tiny body relaxed as soon as Elara's hands touched her. It was as though the pure love in her touch had erased all the fear that had been instilled in her by the cold, impersonal rituals of the past. The sight of her pups, quiet, content, trusting, was all Elara needed to know that this was the right thing to do. This was the future of Frostfall. As the ceremony came to a close, Elara stood and looked out over the courtyard. The pups, now wrapped in warm linen, were cradled in her arms, content and secure. She turned to face Kaelin, her eyes searching his. "Do you think they understand?" she asked softly. Kaelin stepped forward and placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his eyes filled with pride and love. "They understand that they are loved, and that's what matters most." The courtyard was still. The kingdom watched in silence, and for a moment, Elara felt the weight of their expectations. But in that silence, she also felt something else, something stronger than any ritual or tradition. She felt the power of change, the power of love, and the undeniable truth that the kingdom was watching a new tradition take shape. The kingdom's reaction was mixed, as Elara had expected. The older generation, steeped in the customs that had defined Frostfall for centuries, resisted the change. They whispered behind closed doors, their voices laced with disapproval. "This is madness," they said. "What is the world coming to when the royal family disregards centuries of tradition?" But the younger families, the mothers, the fathers who had longed for a new way of life, were inspired. They saw in Elara a reflection of their own struggles, their own desire to care for their children without the weight of an ancient system bearing down on them. Slowly, the word spread. Quietly, families began to embrace the new rituals that Elara had begun. In homes across the kingdom, parents started choosing what felt right for their children, whether it was how they were bathed, how they were nurtured, or how they were raised. The new tradition was not just about the royal family. It was about freedom, the freedom to make choices based on love, not tradition. In the days that followed, Elara felt a sense of empowerment she had never experienced before. She had fought for her children, for her family, and in doing so, she had created something that would change the kingdom forever. The pups thrived in an environment where love was the guiding force. They were not weighed down by rituals that had no meaning for them. They were free to grow in a world where their well-being was the priority. Kalen, too, began to reflect on the changes that had taken place. Not just in the kingdom, but in himself. He had been raised to value duty above all else, but Alara had shown him that love was the truest form of leadership. He was beginning to see that leadership was not just about following orders, it was about listening, understanding, and making choices that would serve the people, especially those who were most vulnerable. As he sat beside Alara one evening, watching their children play in the courtyard, Kalen placed a hand on her knee and looked at her with admiration. "You've done it," he said softly. "You've changed everything." Alara smiled, watching the pups as they giggled and tumbled over one another. "We've done it," she corrected gently. "Together." The sun was setting over Frostfall Castle, casting a soft golden light over the courtyard. The snow, which had fallen thick and heavy in the last few days, glittered under the fading light, a blanket of white that seemed to embrace the castle and the kingdom. The air was cold, but there was warmth in the hearts of the royal family, a warmth that had been absent for far too long. As Alara stood in the courtyard, watching her children play in the fresh snow, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This was their world now, a world built not on the rigidity of royal protocol, but on love, choice, and the bonds of family. It had been a long road to get here, but as she looked at Kalen, standing beside her, his eyes full of admiration and pride, she knew they had found their way. The journey had not been easy. There had been resistance, both from within the palace and beyond, but together they had navigated the storm. Kalen, once so firmly entrenched in the old ways, had come to embrace the very changes that had once seemed impossible, and in doing so, he had not only transformed his kingdom, but his heart. As the pups played in the snow, their laughter echoing in the cold air, Kalen turned to Alara, his gaze soft with reflection. "I never thought it would come to this," he said quietly, his voice filled with wonder. "But now, standing here, I see it. I see the kingdom we're building, not just in the courts, but in our hearts." Alara smiled, her hand slipping into his. "You're not the only one who's changed, Kalen. We've both learned, together." Kalen squeezed her hand, his heart fully softened. "You've taught me so much, Alara. I used to think duty was the only thing that mattered. That tradition was what kept everything together. But now I know that love is the true foundation of leadership. You've made me see that." Alara's heart swelled with pride, but there was something deeper in her chest, an unwavering joy that came from seeing the man beside her, not just as a king, but as a partner, a father, and a leader who had embraced the change that was so desperately needed. "I never asked you to abandon tradition," she said softly. "I just wanted you to see that some traditions aren't meant to last forever. Some things need to evolve, just as we do." Kalen nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "And now, we are building something new, something that will serve the people, not just the throne. A kingdom where love and family come first." The transformation of Frostfall was not just a shift in policies, but a shift in the very spirit of the kingdom. Where once the people had been bound by ancient rites that served no one but the throne, they now found themselves beginning to make their own choices. Alara had sparked a quiet revolution that rippled across the kingdom, and while the change had been slow, it was undeniable. The once stuffy courts that had looked down on Alara's refusal to follow tradition were now filled with murmurs of approval. The noblewomen, who had once silently accepted their roles as mere symbols of power, were now speaking out, questioning the rigid rules that had kept them confined. The mothers of the kingdom, too, had begun to find their voices. No longer were they expected to hand their children over to be bathed by strangers, to follow ancient rituals that didn't serve their families. Instead, they were making choices that felt right for them and their children, just as Alara had done for her own pups. It was a kingdom in flux, but it was a better kingdom. And Alara felt that change, the kind of change that didn't just shift the political landscape, but the hearts of the people. One morning, several months after the first new bathing ritual, Alara stood in the courtyard once again, the pups gathered in her arms. Kalen stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his eyes never leaving their children as they played and tumbled in the snow. There were no grand ceremonies, no flashing gold or expensive oils. It was just the family, united by love, sharing in a moment of quiet peace. A group of noble families had gathered to witness this new royal tradition, and while there were still murmurs of disapproval among the old guard, there were more whispers of admiration. Alara had not only defied tradition, she had redefined it, creating something that was more beautiful and meaningful than any ritual had ever been. As the pups played, Alara gently placed them in the copper basin, their tiny bodies already familiar with the routine. The fire beneath the basin crackled as the snow melted, transforming into warm water that Alara poured over their soft fur, just as she had done from the beginning. But this time, the ceremony felt different. It wasn't just about her pups, it was about everything they had fought for. It was a symbol of the new tradition, one built on love, compassion, and choice. Kalen watched her, his heart full of pride. He had witnessed this transformation, not just in the kingdom, but in himself. He had grown from a king bound by duty to a leader who saw the power of love and family. It was a quiet revolution, but one that would endure far longer than any tradition ever could. Alara finished bathing the pups and wrapped them gently in warm cloths. Their tiny faces looked up at her, their eyes full of trust and love, and for the first time, Alara saw their future clearly. This was the kingdom they would grow up in, one where their needs would come before the protocols, where their parents' love would be their greatest strength. As Alara stood with Kalen, the sound of applause rang through the courtyard. It wasn't from the nobles who still clung to the old ways, but from the mothers, the fathers, and the common folk who had watched this new tradition unfold. They were no longer bound by the coldness of royal rituals. They were free to love their children as they saw fit, to create their own traditions that served their families. The crowd had gathered not to judge, but to witness something powerful, a family, united by love, leading the way toward a brighter future. Alara, Kalen said, his voice full of quiet pride. Look at them. Alara turned to him, her eyes soft. Look at us, she said. We've done it. We've done it together, he replied, squeezing her hand. The moment was perfect, and yet Alara knew that it wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As the day wore on, Alara sat in the royal nursery, watching the pups sleep peacefully in their cribs. Kalen was beside her, a book in his hands, but his thoughts were clearly elsewhere. He had become the kind of king Frostfall needed, a king who led with compassion, who put his family first, and who embraced the idea that tradition was not something to be blindly followed, but something to be molded with care and understanding. Alara, Kalen said softly, breaking the silence. I've been thinking. Alara looked up at him, her heart still light from the day's events. About what? About how far we've come, how much has changed. I never would have imagined that I would be the one to stand beside you in this, but I see now, more than ever, that this, our family, our children, our kingdom, it's all worth fighting for. Alara smiled, her heart full of love. I know. Kaylin paused, looking at her with a new depth of understanding. And I've come to realize that love isn't just something that guides us through the hard times. It's what makes everything worth it. It's the foundation of a strong kingdom and of a strong family. Elara's smile widened as she reached out to take his hand.
It always has been. The kingdom had transformed, quietly but profoundly. Frostfall was no longer a place ruled solely by tradition, but a place where love and family were the guiding principles. And as Elara sat beside Kaylin, watching their children play in the courtyard, she knew that the change she had fought for, alongside her husband, her partner, had not only redefined the royal family, but had shaped the future of the kingdom itself.